Good morning, everybody. I think we're ready to get started. If you want to take your seats.
Well, we'll try one more time. Does this work? Works good? Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to Pastor Catie and Pastor Blake for having me this morning. I'm Catie Edmondson. I'm a congressional correspondent for the New York Times. I'm also Pam Frey's niece, very proudly. And I'm happy to be here today to talk with you a little bit about what it's like to work for the New York Times, this current election cycle, which right now is the focus of most of the work that I'm doing. And I'm hoping to leave the last 20 minutes or so for questions. I'm hoping there will be a lot of questions because I know it's so much more interesting to have actual discussions as opposed to just me sort of talking at you. But that is what I have been asked to do nonetheless. I started working at the New York Times in 2018. I started as a summer intern, actually, a 3-month internship, which I was able to just hang on to by sort of the skin of my teeth and turn into a full-time job. Part of that was luck and the timing of the news cycle. Toward the end of my internship in 2018 was the confirmation process of now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. That was a real trial by fire for me up on the Hill because I was fairly new to actually working on Capitol Hill, it's a tough place to get to know because it is a sprawling physical complex. Reporters are really given free rein over the building. That's why I think it's actually one of the best reporting jobs in Washington. You can run up to members of Congress, you go up to senators, to congressmen, congresswomen, and you ask them their questions. And that was initially an extremely intimidating idea for me when I first got up on the Hill. The idea that I, a 22-year-old fresh out of college, was supposed to, for example, go up to Senator Mitch McConnell and ask him a tough question. But I quickly learned that that was just part of the job. And in fact, if I wanted to be good at my job, that was something I was going to have to get used to. But the Kavanaugh confirmation was a particularly fraught time to be up there. It was a very emotionally fraught time. And there were lots and lots of other reporters up on the Hill. And I just remember distinctly, I think it was maybe my first week that I was up there. My editor asked me to track down Senator Jeff Flake, who at the time was sort of a key vote on the Judiciary panel. He had made some comments about potentially being concerned about whether the confirmation could go forward. And so I and every other reporter on the Hill, and there were, I want to say, over 100 of us, frankly, we're all running after him one evening saying, Senator, how are you going to vote on this key, in this key committee hearing? And he was, fairly literally running away from us. We were running after him. And a lot of the time we spend is in the Senate basement. And this is where there's actually, it's almost like a subway system. It's a little train, and senators are able to take the train from their office buildings, which are actually outside the Capitol Dome. They take the train from their offices to the Capitol Dome to vote and then back. And he was waiting for one of the trains. The train was not coming, but one across the room was. And so we were chasing after him, Senator, Senator, how are you going to vote? Do you have concerns, Senator? And he actually jumped across a train track into an oncoming train, which then pulled away from us. And he kind of just smiled and waved. And I remember just seeing this unfold in front of me and thinking, this is crazy, right? This is absurd. Certainly, this is going to be the height of insanity up at the Hill. Things will calm down after this. And obviously, I was totally wrong. And really, that sort of set that became par for the course for now. I've been up on the Hill for 6 years. And unfortunately, that has been fairly consistent, that level of craziness with the levels of storylines that we have covered. So I started in 2018, started with the Kavanaugh confirmation. We since covered 2 impeachments, January 6th, the 2020 election. And for me, because I have been focusing on the House and in particular the Republican majority in the House, the election of Speaker Kevin McCarthy, the ouster of Speaker McCarthy, and then the election of Speaker now Mike Johnson, and also an attempt to oust him as well. So it has been a chaotic years up on the Hill. It's been sometimes great fun to cover. It has also sometimes been, frankly, fairly depressing to have a front row seat to some of the events that have played out on the Hill that I think sort of broadly the nation wishes wouldn't. Um, Right now, I am focused on the congressional elections in November. Obviously, we end up covering a lot of the top of the ticket race, the Harris-Trump race as well, because it does have trickle-down implications for example, the House and Senate races. For example, I was recently out on Michigan State's campus. And it was actually one of the more interesting stories that I've done recently because I was interviewing college students on the campus specifically about how they were feeling about the election. I wanted to go to Michigan State because they're actually at the epicenter of incredibly competitive, important races that could decide not only who's in the White House, but also who has control of the Senate and the House. They have a competitive House Senate seat. And of course, Michigan is a hugely important presidential election. One of the things that I really like about my job, I do love chasing after lawmakers. I do love understanding how they're thinking about issues, but probably my favorite part or one of my favorite parts about the job is talking with voters. And it's understanding how they're feeling about the way the country is going, how they feel about particular issues. And I often find that I'm really surprised by what I hear. And I think, if you think about conversations that you have with your friends, your neighbors, sometimes they'll say one thing, they'll say this is my ideology, and then they'll say and this is how I'm voting on this policy, and you might think what those two things have nothing to do with each other. I often find that in general people don't necessarily have very strict prescriptive ideas about things, and I like understanding how voters are sort of piecing together how they're feeling and how that translates to their votes. And so I was particularly interested when I was talking to the students at Michigan State. And I guess I should not have been really surprised by this, but I was by the intensity of their comments nonetheless. There were so many students I talked to who said that when President Biden was at the top of the ticket as the Democratic presidential nominee, they were planning on not voting in the election at all, or they were planning on potentially voting for a third party candidate. And I kind of understood that. And namely, they were telling me it wasn't necessarily a particular policy of President Biden's or the Biden administration. They were saying simply, we feel that he is too old to be president. We'd like someone who's younger. And then I asked them, okay, well, how are you feeling about the election now? And particularly the people who said that they were thinking about voting for a third party candidate. I was very surprised to hear a lot of them say, we plan to support Vice President Harris. For example, I talked to a freshman actually from Tennessee who was on campus who had planned to vote for RFK Jr. And he said, now, I'm leaning on voting for Kamala Harris. And if you look at those two policy positions, right, there's not a lot of overlap between the RFK Jr. platform and the Harris platform, but what he was articulating was that he wanted change. He wanted a fresh face. He wanted someone new. There are obviously many arguments to be made about whether the current vice president, truly does represent, actual transformational change. But this is what the students were telling me. And what I understood that to translate for the congressional seats is that, a lot of these kids were not focused on who was running for Senate. They didn't know who was running for the House. But if they had not voted at all, right, they certainly would not have been voting for some of those down ballot candidates. And so that was just a particularly interesting story to me because it was one that surprised me because I don't think that I realized sort of the depth of apathy on some of these campuses for the Biden-Harris ticket when he was still at the top of the ticket. And I think Democrats would have had a real turnout problem when, they really do rely on college campuses turning out to a large degree. So that's an example of a story that I did recently that I really enjoyed because, again, the results surprised me. And I think that speaks to something that I try to do, certainly whether I am reporting a story from the Hill or out in the country, is that you always start with kind of a thesis or an idea or a question, right? My question was, I wonder how college students are feeling about the election right now. I had thought I'd actually pitched the story back when President Biden was at the top of the ticket. And so I was asking that question because I thought, I wonder if they do have some of these concerns about his age. But I never go out there thinking that I know the answer. I never go out there knowing, well, this is what I'm going to end up writing. I need to be able to do the reporting first. I need to talk to people and hear what they're telling me, and really be open to lots of different responses, not, say, oh, that person said that, but, they're not representative of anything. I try to go in just with the most open mind and open notebook. And then at the end of the day, I look at my notes and see, okay, what did they really tell me? And then I start to write my story. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight, because a lot of times, and I speak to many different groups, whether it's in DC or in other parts of the country. And I think increasingly, some of the questions that I get start from the supposition that the editors at the New York Times and other major publications sort of come up with what the news of the day is. They say, this is, the story we want our reporters to write. And then, I get a note saying, write a story saying Michigan State students are, X, Y, and Z. And I say, okay, and that's really not the way it works. Obviously, there are some news of the day events that happen that simply are so obvious that we have to cover. An example that I used was, it was not like when we had the Butler, Pennsylvania rally that suddenly our editors were like, what would get a lot of clicks? If we covered the attempted assassination of the Republican presidential frontrunner, right? It was just such a major story that, of course, that was where the focus went. But I share this just because, for my colleagues and I who have a specific beat, a specific topic that we cover, we're really looking every day to try to figure out what's changed here, what's an interesting dynamic that our readers might not understand that we can explain to them, what's a dynamic that I personally don't understand, and how can I interrogate that and come up with some kind of answer. And that really largely is how our stories are developed. And so much of it really is bottom up rather than top down. Let's see. Okay, so a normal day for me, it really depends on what year we're in and what time of year we're in. Right now, I'm doing a lot of campaign travel. As I mentioned, I was in Michigan. I've come here to Wisconsin actually a couple of times to report on the Senate race here. I'm going to Arizona on Friday for a story about the split ticket voters, people who are going to be supporting former President Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, but actually are voting for the Democratic Senate candidate nonetheless. I'm very interested in understanding why that is and what's motivating them. We know from polling that that's actually a sizable group of people. And so that's what I'll be doing on Friday. I think actually one of the dynamics that I just mentioned, which is the idea that some people believe that we generate our stories based off of what an editor says, or there's some sort of meeting that we have, speaks to a larger issue that also always comes up when I talk to people, which is the idea of eroding trust in media. And I get a lot of questions, and it is a hugely important problem. And I always say that, I think solving it on an institutional scale is far beyond my pay grade. But it is something that I think a lot about when I go out and I do talk to voters in different parts of the countries. I've been to Trump rallies, I've been to very conservative districts where in general, I would say we tend to get, the New York Times tends to get a bit of a chillier reception from people. And the way that I think about it is, the one thing that I think I can do personally as a reporter is, especially when I'm talking to a voter who maybe doesn't have a great idea of what the New York Times does or is. Typically, I'm thinking that I'm probably the first New York Times reporter and potentially the first reporter for a mainstream news organization that they've ever met and potentially might ever meet in the future. And so my goal is just to give them the best possible experience, to show them that I really care about what they have to say. I'm really listening to them. The reason that I've traveled out to wherever they are in the country, right, at great expense to our organization, is because we want to elevate what they think and let our readers know that. And also, frankly, just to show them that, if I can show them that I'm a nice person, that I showed them kindness, that I think is kind of the best I can do as just one reporter, to try to show, maybe you won't trust the New York Times, maybe you don't trust the mainstream media still, but at the very least you can say, well, I met this one girl who worked for it and she was actually very nice. I will say also that, I have reported from a Trump rally. They typically are not happy to see that the people at the Trump rally are typically not happy to see that New York Times reporters are there. The Trump campaign is happy for the New York Times to cover their rallies. obviously. But I've actually never had anyone be rude to me face to face. I certainly get enough on email and social media that unfortunately is not particularly kind. But I do actually find it heartening that when you sit down with someone face to face, right, maybe they say, oh, we hate your organization, we think you're such liars, but then they'll often add something like, but you seem really nice though, or, but not you. And that's fine. That's if I can have that one-to-one connection with them, that's, I feel I'm doing the best that I can. But I also am somewhat heartened to see that I think some of the vitriol that is easier, to stoke online when you are face to face, I still have never had really a bad experience with someone who doesn't like the New York Times. And also, I've been focusing a lot on sort of the conservative aspect of this because I mostly cover Republicans. That's kind of the way that my team has been broken down. But there are also certainly, I would say, people who consider themselves to be on the very far left spectrum, who also have various problems with the New York Times. So it's certainly not a partisan issue, I would say. So yes, so on the campaign trail, really anything, anything can go. I can be talking with voters. I can be going with candidates to their events. I was able to sit down a couple weekends ago, actually, with Senator Tammy Baldwin and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, and I was particularly interested in sitting down with them because really I wanted to ask the question, Governor Shapiro, you're a busy man. What are you doing out here in Wisconsin with the senator? That was for a story about their efforts to capture rural voters and reach out to some voters in traditionally conservative districts of Wisconsin that they seem to be doing a good job of it. They seem to be getting a good reception from what I saw on the campaign trail. But of course, we'll see what the results are in November. Most of the time, though, when we're not in an election cycle, I am working on Capitol Hill. My desk is physically like under the dome. That is the structure that we work in. It's the Senate Press Gallery. It is steps from the Senate chamber. And that is part of why we have so much physical access to these members, is we are right there. It's really interesting. A lot of my time is, I'm on the phone, I'm talking with congressional aides, I'm talking with lobbyists, but a lot of the times I am talking with the members themselves. And it's really interesting to be in such close proximity to them because you really get a sense of how they think about things. You get a sense of their media diet. For example, there was one day, I think I was in the Senate basement and a senator in Republican leadership, who was an avid reader of the New York Times, walked up to me and he said, "You had a story today. It was on A1, and then it jumped to page 17." And I said, "Yes, I did, Senator." And then he just kind of nodded at me and then he walked away. So I don't know what he thought about that story, but he certainly knew what page it was on. But it does reflect, right? I mean, it's a fundamentally silly story, but it does fundamentally reflect that these members do really, whether they like the New York Times or not, they do really closely read it. And so I've also had instances where I've had members come up and thank me for a story that I've written. I've had instances where I've had a lawmaker come up to me and say, I have several bones to pick with your story, and I'm going to go through the points now. And that's a conversation where you sit and you listen. And if they have a point on one of them, you say, yeah, I think point 3 was very good, Senator. I'll, take that under advisement, or maybe we can do another story that, flicks at that a little bit. Sometimes you just say, I understand, I think we stand by our story, but, I'm happy to have these conversations with you. But it does, I think, make you very aware of every word that you write when you know that not only are, lots of people going to be reading about it, but in fact, the person that you are writing about is going to read about it and in fact might come up to you the next day to have a chat about it. I think it's a great form of reporter accountability, to be honest. I think it can be very easy to think, well, no one's really reading this, we'll just publish this. And I think it honestly is a very good system in place to have people who are affected be able to talk with you face to face about it. And it's certainly much better than angry emails. The other thing, though, that I have gotten to realize about the lawmakers themselves, and that I had to let sink in because I was so initially intimidated by the idea of going up to them and asking questions, is that they're just people, which seems like a really, straightforward thing to understand. But I think it actually cuts both ways. Because I think that we currently are in an environment where There can be a tendency to regard politicians as heroes sometimes, to think that they're amazing and to have, feel like you have a real relationship with them. And there's also a tendency, right, to just say, that politician is the worst and to just feel so much, vitriol toward them. And it goes both ways, right? They're just people. Some of the lawmakers who my friends say, God, they seem so amazing. You've spoken with them. How are they? Are they really that brilliant? You go, oh, like, no, they're they're just a person. And there are also, lawmakers who my friends go, God, that they're just the worst. I can't believe you ever, even talk to them. They must just be so terrible. What's your experience? It's like, oh, they actually, they're okay, actually. They might have some ideas that you don't agree with, but, they're okay. And I try to take that with me as I interact with lawmakers, because I have to talk with people on every part of the spectrum. One of the things that is a little bit harder for me to think about is that and again, I cover mostly House Republicans at this point. So I'm not saying that this phenomenon doesn't exist in other demographics. It's just the one that I know the best. So that's what I tend to talk about. There are some lawmakers who have, think they're a little bit more ideological. They come off as being more ideological or having more extreme views, more on the end of the spectrum rather than centrist. And there are some lawmakers who truly believe it, right? They are true ideologues, right? They truly would love to see the federal budget slashed by 50%. They believe, the federal government is like a truly evil organizing principle, and the extent to which it is made smaller, the better. There are also lawmakers who, based off of my reporting, based off of my private conversations with them, sometimes will endorse ideas that I don't know that they necessarily really care if those policies are enforced, but they know it's good politics, right? And they know that endorsing them will get them on TV. And being on TV means you become more famous, and being more famous means you can fundraise more, which means you have more money, and that gives you power in a place like DC. And so sometimes it's funny, you might be able to say to a lawmaker, sir, on the record, for my story, what do you think of this policy? What do you think about this move? And they'll say, well, I think it's great and blah, blah, blah. And then you might say to them, well, off the record, don't you think that's kind of crazy? And they'll go, oh yeah, but like whatever. To be clear, I try not to quote those people anymore. If I know for a fact that I think that they're endorsing something that they don't believe in because they think it's politically expedient for them, I try not to quote them because I don't want to deal with people in bad faith like that, right? I always ask my questions in good faith. I want them to engage with me in good faith as well. One of the things, and sometimes, right, it is something like political expedience. Sometimes it can be something more sinister. I remember after January 6th, doing a lot of reporting with Republicans, and this was published in a story, so I'm not sharing any stories out of school here. But I spoke with one Republican Congressman, Pete Meyer, who had voted to uphold the election results. He was a freshman, so this was his first week in Congress, was January 6th. And he said that he remembered talking with a Republican colleague on the House floor before voting. And the way that they vote on the House floor is they're almost like credit cards, it's little electronic cards that you put in, and then you press a button, yes or no. And he said that he had just voted to uphold the election results, and he saw a colleague, a Republican, standing next to him on the House floor who was like fiddling with it. And he said, what do you think? How are you going to vote? And he said that his colleague said, well, I'd like to vote to uphold it, but I've been getting some really scary calls from my constituents. And I'm kind of worried about what's going to happen to my family if I don't vote this way. And then he went and voted not to uphold the election results. And that speaks to a theme that I have increasingly seen in my 6 years, which is the threat of menace in our politics. And sometimes that threat of menace is actually raised and elevated by the lawmakers themselves, right, in their rhetoric. And sometimes it's raised by their constituents. One of the more depressing stories that I wrote was when the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed in gosh, I can't remember what year. It was early on in President Biden's term. It was basically like, let's send a bunch of money to rebuild roads and bridges across the country. It became an intensely partisan fight for some reason, largely because I think Republicans, one, are generally opposed to increases in federal spending, but two, I think we're not thrilled about the idea about handing President Biden a win so early on in his term. And I think, I can't remember the number of House Republicans who ultimately voted for. I want to say it was somewhere between 9 and 12 Republicans ultimately voted for the infrastructure bill, pretty anodyne vote. And I remember hearing and reporting out the story that they were just flooded with death threats and other, just horrible invective messages, for basically for voting for like a new bridge for their community, right? It wasn't even something as fraught as who gets to have control of the White House. It was, I voted for some bridges. And so that is something that concerns me. I don't know the answer to that, other than if everyone were to sign sort of a mutual agreement to dial down the temperature, which I think unfortunately is not going to happen. I don't know how we solve it. So that is something that I think a lot about in our coverage in general. Obviously, sort of came to a peak in the past couple of months with some of the actual acts of violence that we've seen. And I think this also ends, and this is kind of a pessimistic note to end on. I think you'll find that most reporters tend to be pessimists, unfortunately, and I tend to fall in that camp too. When we look at what is going to happen in November, it seems it's possible that one party could get total control of government. It seems probably unlikely that that should happen. And in the House, which again is the chamber that I mostly cover, it seems all but certain that regardless of whether Republicans have the House majority or Democrats hold the House majority, it's going to be a very narrow majority. That's just based off of the way that the gerrymandering works. There are very, very few competitive districts in the country at this point. And so a question that I get a lot sometimes is, well, does the idea that it's going to be a super slim House majority point to more bipartisanship happening? Which, right, in a normal logical world, I think would suggest that. Like, let's try to work together since no one really has the monopoly on power here. I think it really depends on control of the Senate and the White House. But my prediction would be that it points to more gridlock. Which is something obviously no one really wants to see. But I've talked a little bit about the incentive structures currently in Congress. The idea that if you say something provocative and get on TV, you can become famous and you can make money. Those are not structures that encourage bipartisanship and working across the aisle. So we will see what happens. There have been a few notable examples in which there have been sort of a bipartisan majority in the House where Republicans and Democrats have linked arms to vote for something. And the number one example I would give for that was aid to Ukraine. That was a piece of legislation that I think most people, the conventional wisdom in Washington for quite some time was that Speaker Mike Johnson was never going to allow it to come to a vote. It was sort of a long personal journey for him as well as a political journey for him as well. He ultimately let it come to the floor for a vote, and we saw almost a majority of House Republicans and almost all House Democrats vote to push it through. I don't know that we will ever see something like that again in the near future, but it is an example of a time where conventional wisdom that Washington gridlock was going to stop something actually didn't come true. So I'll try to leave it on that, more optimistic note that, sometimes you can be surprised, right? Which is sort of the theme of the first, the first anecdote, which is that I'm constantly surprised in this job. And so we have 15 minutes left, so I gave a little less time than I had hoped for questions, but are there questions? Otherwise, I can go, yes. Oh, she's a microphone for you, I think.
Yeah, actually, we have half an hour, so
Oh,
go to
good.
15. So
Oh, good. Okay.
yeah,
I have granddaughters. Walk us through the process of getting an internship with the New York Times.
Oh, sure. It's a great question. So I worked for my college newspaper all 4 years of college. I started covering actually the administration of my university, covering the president. And it's so funny because I was just talking to someone who I worked on the newspaper with. And the difference between what I do now and what I did on my college newspaper, obviously the scale is very different, but the fundamentals are exactly the same, right? It's dealing with spokespeople, it's dealing with someone who is in power, who has an incentive, to try to get out the best possible version of stories. So I highly recommend working on a college newspaper or a local newspaper. Then every summer after college, I did an internship. I actually interned after my sophomore year of college here in Madison, covering the State House for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And then after my senior year, I was able to intern at the New York Times. Part of that was my editor at the Boston Globe, which is my internship after my junior year, knew someone at the Times and recommended it to me. So also, for anyone looking to go into journalism, it's a very small industry, which is another reason why, you always want to be putting your best foot forward and being as kind as possible, because it's very small and you never know, who's going to end up being able to help you or, hurt you. And then once I was at the Times internship, I was pitching a lot of my own story ideas. But also, I went in initially, and so I started in the summer of 2018, and this was the big Russia investigation was happening. It was sort of the height of a lot of big political intrigue stories in DC. And I remember thinking like, oh gosh, like I'm going to get to help out with all these stories. This is so great. And then my first assignment was the Washington Capitals, the hockey team, right, had won the Stanley Cup. And the editor was like, why don't you go to the parade and write a story about Washington celebrating their first Stanley Cup? And initially, like my first reaction, to be very honest, was like, that's not that's not the Russia investigation. That's not what I was sent here to cover, like political stories. That's not what I was sent here to do. But I quickly realized, well, this is what they're asking you to do. You're an intern. It's your first day. This is what they're asking you to do. So then I was like, right, I'm gonna write the best gosh darn parade story that these people have ever seen. And they loved it, right? And so then I got harder assignments. And so part of it, I think also my advice to, high school students, college students, is when you come in for an internship, you completely should, shoot for the stars and think, here are a couple of really big, hard-hitting stories that I want to do. But at the end of the day, you have to show them first that you can really just do a tremendous job at the smaller tasks they ask you to do. And you can't think that you're too important to do them, because you are, after all, an intern, which is something I had to get through my head. Yes, I had graduated. So it's very common at this point for journalists to intern somewhere after they graduate from college, that summer after graduation, and then those internships can be parlayed into full-time jobs. But it's honestly quite rare at this point for reporters to have a full-time job immediately after graduation. Yeah. Are there any other questions? There's one here too.
This may not be germane right at this point in time, but this may not be germane at this point in time, but I'm wondering if you have heard discussions about the Electoral College.
Sure. So it's not something that I follow as closely, to be honest with you, as a congressional reporter. What was interesting was, and you might be referring a little bit to this, was that there was discussion over whether or not there's a congressional district in Nebraska. It's the second congressional district of Nebraska. It's the Omaha area. And somehow they themselves, the congressional district, has one electoral vote. And so there was a big push, both among the Trump and the Harris campaign, for whether or not to strip that district of their one electoral vote. The Trump campaign was hoping to strip it because that is an area that is trending blue. It's sort of becoming like, a whole, the shorthand is like a Whole Foods, like, suburban outside of a big city town. And Democrats wanted to keep it because they were thinking that's one extra electoral vote for us. Somehow this all came down to a pressure campaign on one particular guy, and you might know better than I would the apparatus that he sat on. I can't remember if it was a county board, but basically this pressure campaign came down to one guy who, I think he was a Democrat, and he recently flipped his party affiliation to Republican. So there's a lot of intrigue, right? This is the kind of political baseball that, I have colleagues in DC who just, salivate over. And so part of it was there was a real question of what this man was going to do, because he was a Democrat, then he flipped to Republican. He ultimately put out a statement saying that he thought it would be rash to make any major changes to the Electoral College so soon before the election. This was a discussion that happened just a couple weeks ago. So there actually are, I've been saying someone from my team needs to go out to Nebraska too. I'm hoping it's not me, because I've got my Arizona trip. I don't want to tamper with that. But there are major implications now for that House race as well, because again, we know control over the House is going to be so tight. But also there's going to be just a heck of a lot of money flooding into that. The poor citizens of, Omaha basically are just going to see ad after ad after ad, because the stakes are so high now. It's not just the House, but now they're gunning for one electoral vote as well. In terms of whether there would be any more like significant broad scale changes to the Electoral College, that I simply could not predict. I think a lot of it, again, would depend on what happens in November, because those conversations tend to perennially bubble up when one party's not happy with how things went for them, right? But I also think in general, something that I've noticed in DC is that, large scale systemic change, people are very resistant to, and it takes a really long time. So it's hard to think of some sort of major change happening that's not like the level we were talking about, the one electoral college or electoral vote changing, but that's probably as much as I can say in an informed way on that question. I think, did you? Oh, yes.
First, thanks for doing this, and wondering if you wanted to share your experiences with January 6th and if that led to any changes in your approach.
Yeah, it's a great question. I was not on the Hill on January 6th. This was during sort of peak COVID, if you remember. So we were actually encouraged not to have everyone on our team up on the Hill. So we split up who's going to be on the Hill and who was going to be working from home. So I was working from home, but I live like a 20-minute walk from the Capitol, so I could hear everything, and I had my colleagues up there. And, it seems silly now, because when we were reporting on the buildup to January 6th after the fact, everything was out in the open for the most part, right? Like if you were on these messaging boards, you would have seen people being like, who's bringing the gallows? Like, we're all marching on January 6th. But we really, at least I think I can say for most people up on the Hill, whether they were a reporter or people who work in the building, because those are my sources, right? I talked to lots of different people who work in congressional offices. I don't think there really was any idea that anything like that could ever happen. And I think we also thought that, in a situation where there was some sort of like unruly crowd, that the Capitol Police would be able to easily put it down. But I remember listening to the rally that former President Trump had at the Ellipsis, and I remember him saying, "We're all going to walk to the Capitol now." And I remember messaging my team like, "Hey, Trump just said everyone's going to march to the Capitol. Like, you might want to just like keep your wits about you." And that was kind of like what we thought was going to be. You're going to keep your wits about you. Like, there might be weird stuff happening. And then obviously it escalated very quickly. And yeah, I mean, it's a very tough day to talk about, frankly, even though I wasn't there. Because we were also getting, like, I had colleagues who were lying on the floor of the House chamber while Capitol Police had their guns drawn, and they were hearing gunshots outside the chamber. And so I was very worried that my colleagues were potentially going to be shot. That obviously did not come to pass. In terms of how it changed our coverage, or whether it changed our coverage, uh, ooh, I mean, it was, I think, a tough thing for everyone to internalize. We saw this among the lawmakers as well. Initially, there were Republican lawmakers who were very, very angry, who felt like, President Trump should have done more to dispatch help to the Capitol, that he had, sicked his supporters on them. There was a lot of anger among lawmakers, feeling that former Vice President Pence, had been put in an intolerable situation, and that his life obviously had been put at risk. So there was initially a lot of anger there. And then as time went on, it sort of subsided, right? It's not really something you hear Republican lawmakers talking about. that much anymore. I think, for myself, coverage wise, I was thinking about it from the perspective of like, my job ultimately is still to explain how things, right? How did things get to this point? My job is to explain how lawmakers are feeling about this. My job is to explain whether or not Republican lawmakers are going to change any of their behavior as a result of this. But I think it was also a reminder. Look, the former president often says a lot of really provocative things. And I think when it's such a constant barrage of that, sometimes it's easy to get desensitized to that. And I think it was obviously a very close to home reminder for a lot of us that there really are consequences to that, and to think about that as we're covering the rhetoric, right? And that rhetoric can turn into action. I think it was probably also of, you're talking about how does it affect the coverage broadly. I think it also was probably a very individual experience for every reporter, certainly those who were there. But at the end of the day, right, our job is to explain and to like understand. So I don't think that changed anything fundamentally about what we do. But yeah, as you can tell, as I'm sort of, awkwardly walking through this, it was a tough experience.
Yeah, this is going to sound ignorant and naive and okay, but I'm trying to understand what the different political parties stand for anymore.
Mm.
It seems like what I grew up with doesn't exist as a political ideology. So what is the current ideology?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It is probably not one that I can succinctly answer here, but I think what you're talking about, and again, I'm going to go to the Republicans because I cover them the most closely. We've seen a real schism, right? And I think someone who has the foreign policy ideology of someone like Senator J.D. Vance, for example, right, is a very far cry from what you would think of as the traditional peace through strength, like Reagan. We want to be, if not the world's policeman, we want to show a strong military force abroad. At the same time, right, he's in the same party as Senator Mitch McConnell, who was like, I would say, one of the most ardent voices in support of sending aid to Ukraine, and generally is one of the strongest interventionists on the Hill. Now, Senator McConnell's influence, I don't think anyone would dispute, has, waned in a sort of incredible way in the last few years in his party. And of course, he'll be stepping down as Republican leader at the end of the year, and we'll have someone new take that position to lead the Senate Republican Conference. But I think one of the reasons why you're seeing this muddled ideology is that there are true rifts, at least in the Republican Party. And it's not just on foreign policy, right? It's also about to what degree should we spend federal money to help working class people's lives improve? Something that's been really interesting. And again, I keep drawing on members of Congress because that's what I know the best. People like Senator Josh Hawley, speaking of January 6th, he is someone who has increasingly put himself out there as someone who would approve spending federal money if it helps like working class people. I covered legislation recently that he's been a real champion of, and it helps that he has a number of people in his state who are affected. But he is a real champion of a bill that would authorize, God, I can't remember what the numbers, a huge amount of federal dollars to help workers, people who are exposed to nuclear radiation from the Cold War era. And that's not something that I think ordinarily you would think a Republican in his sort of political milieu would like support. You would think, oh, this is an anti-spend guy. But there are people like him, and to some degree, JD Vance to some degree, right, who are sort of saying like, if we want to be the party of the working class, we have to put our money where our mouth is. Then you have a number of Republicans who are very much sort of saying, absolutely not. We need to cut federal spending. I will never vote for a bill like that. And so I think that's what creates the confusion that you're talking about. I think foreign policy wise, in the Democratic Party, right, we see a similar schism, not so much on issues like Ukraine, but for example, Israel, Palestine are continuing to send aid to Israel, right? There's very fierce divisions within the party there. And I think, again, I would say in general, when it comes to their sort of economic platform, I think Democrats are a little bit more united than Republicans are right now, at least in Congress. But I think there are real ideological rifts that are being worked out in each party right now. I think in general, you tend to get a sense of which one is ascendant, depending on what issue you're talking about. But I do think that leads to the muddled ideology. And it's also, frankly, one of the reasons why you see now some prominent Republicans coming out to endorse the Harris Walz campaign, right, is because the ideologies have gotten so topsy-turvy in a way. I'm sorry I can't give you like a better printer, but I'm just here to validate basically your confusion. Yeah. Yes.
So,
Oh, sorry.
you
Someone has a
mentioned
microphone.
several times your team. What do
Oh.
you mean by your team?
Sure. So I'm on the Congress team. There are, gosh, we keep changing because people have, babies and moved to different teams, but there are about half a dozen of us that cover Congress for the New York Times, and we each have kind of a dedicated demographic, a political demographic that we cover on the Hill, and then we also have a specific policy area that we focus on. So mine are, House Republicans, House Republican leadership, but then also federal spending. So every time there's been a government shutdown scare or the debt limit negotiations, that unfortunately was me. Yeah. So, I have a colleague who covers mostly like the foreign policy defense portfolio on the Hill. I have a colleague that's been covering most of the Republican-led investigations in the House. So there are about half a dozen of us, and we all cover the House and the Senate, but it's sort of divvied up more by themes. Yes.
You said you basically caucus with the pessimists. Did you 6 years ago?
I did. I don't think that I'm more pessimistic now than I was 6 years ago. Oh, this is an interesting question because it requires me to reflect on my own thoughts as opposed to just telling you what I've seen on the Hill. The thing that I said about lawmakers being people and it cutting both ways, I think really encapsulates my experience up on the Hill. There are some amazing people who are really smart, and I hope they do really well. And there are some people who, are not so great. And I think are a little bit more what people conjure up when they think of, the swamp of DC and how terrible DC is. It's a tough Congress is a tough place. When I was sort of in the middle part of covering the Hill, there was a lot of interesting legislation that was passing, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, that was the semiconductor bill, trying to get more semiconductors made here in the US rather than abroad. And that was really interesting to cover. But it also was the sense the Congress was doing something. And most of what I've been covering recently has been Congress waiting until the very last moment to avert a crisis. And as a journalist, that's not as fulfilling, right? And as an American, it's also disappointing to see. And I think that's generally what most people think of Congress. Polling indicates that's what most people sort of view Congress as doing, is sort of like dithering until the last minute and not doing that much to help Americans. So just as, an American myself, that is probably the most disheartening part of covering Congress.
Thank you so much for being here. And I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for being here. We hear and see the word rhetoric a lot. And I'm needing to really look that up because without putting you on the spot, what is the difference between rhetoric and not telling the truth?
Oh, interesting. Well, I think we typically use rhetoric in our newspaper just as a shorthand for not only what people are saying, but the way that they say it. But I think what you're getting at also is, and I think it has been, I think widely acknowledged as an issue that has befallen reporters, is using sort of euphemisms, right, to avoid like reporting out harder truths, right? And I think it's a really tough discussion. I think especially this was a conversation that came up in 2016, I think, in a big way, because we had for the first time a presidential candidate who just spoke and said things in a way that no one really ever had, right? Things that were just patently untrue, things that, were demeaning of certain groups of people. And I think it was really hard. And I'm sort of speaking in a remove because in 2016 I was still in college, so I wasn't, I wasn't in the trenches yet. But I think it was really hard for reporters to figure out, well, how do we write about this in a way that explains what he's doing and what he's saying, but also, is not dismissive toward the people who, are supporting him. Like, how do we factor in all of these things? And I think as a profession, we've gotten much better at it, to be honest, since 2016, calling a spade a spade. I often get emails from readers who are upset that we haven't put a specific label on things. And sometimes I think, people can agree to disagree on this. Sometimes I don't know that what they're looking for is necessarily the best way to approach it. For example, I'm trying to think if there was an example of something that I've written recently. But a lot of times when this comes up is I remember, there was a time where it was like, this is obviously racist. You should say that either what they did was racist or you should say that this person is a racist in the coverage. And that opens up a big can of worms, right? To call someone that term infers that you understand how they think about a certain set of issues. And I think you can infer that from language, but it's like, I always am loath to try to make it seem like in my writing, I know what's in someone's head, because you can never know what is in someone else's head. So what I often find to be the most valuable is to just in the most explicit, unsparing terms, right? Like, this is what the person said, or like, when this person printed out this ad, like, this is what the ad looked like, right? And then people can sort of, one, ascertain for themselves, come to some sort of conclusion for themselves. But I don't, I also think that there is a school of thought that's like, well, if you just wrote that this candidate, is this, is ist, is sexist, is racist, then people would read it and then no one would vote for them and then it wouldn't be a problem anymore. And that's just not right. We've seen that's just not quite the way that it works. So I think that's sort of the broader theme of what you're getting at, right? And I think it is a real conversation that we have continued to have. It's just a tough one. You have to take things on a case by case basis. And you also really want to make sure that you're not assuming that what someone is thinking or trying to do better than they themselves do it. I don't think, I am not sympathetic to anyone trying to pull any punches because they're uncomfortable with the idea of calling out someone in a position of power. But I also think, a lot of times these things are really tricky. And I think as much as you can come in with a nuanced opinion and just trying to I'm just going to show you, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened here is kind of the way that I personally try to approach it.
Thank you so much for responding to
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
A lot of times it seems like in reading news stories, there can be like false equivalence in like the reporters doing their stories where they'll almost kind of be like an intentional effort to make some kind of like, oh, well, this side says this and the other side says this. And sometimes those things seem just so kind of disjointed or just like comparing apples to oranges. And I'm just curious from your perspective, if you feel like, our reporters, is that an intentional choice? Is that something like, why does that happen, I guess?
Yeah, it's something that obviously we try not to do as much as possible. Part of it is I do think, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, you're asking why does it happen? And it's a good question. And I think the reason is that the sort of old school model of doing political journalism was like team A says this and team B says this. And then, you let the reader decide, right, which one they think is better. But it was a situation now where sometimes it's like team A says the sky is blue, team B says the sky is red. And it's like, you can't leave those two things and just be like, well, we'll leave it to the reader to decide which one they think is better. So what I do think is valuable is, if you are in some sort of situation where you're trying to explain, this is what, this person was saying, this was their response, is to actually just do the fact check like right under it, which is something I try to do a lot. Because sometimes you will be in a situation where, for example, I might be writing about, this is going to be a total hypothetical. Let's say there's a Senate race and there's an ad that Senator A is running, and it's like, it seems to be, polling shows it's really connecting, and I'm writing about this ad and why it's really helping this campaign. So we might say, the ad says this, right? And that's coming from Camp B. It's an attack ad. And then you would want to do like, Senator A says like, this isn't true. And then you would have to jump to be like, okay, here's what's actually going on, right? They're referring to this, like it's a little more complicated than that. There are just sometimes in political journalism, because for the most part, it is fundamentally two sides, where you kind of have to lay out like, okay, we're going to give you the environment of like what's actually what the discussion is. But then I think what you have to do is you have to pull back and you have to give context and you have to fact check, and you can't let one side just run away with whatever it is they want to say. And I've had fights with, I won't say campaigns, but I've had folks fights with, various camps where they'll say, well, we're saying that this is our line. Why aren't you putting in our line into your story? It's like, because it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like, let's have the discussion right now. If you can convince me this line is based in fact, I'll put it into my story, but you've been so far unable to do that. But I do think it is kind of like not a reflex, but I do think it's somewhat built into journalistic muscle memory. And that's one of the reasons why you see it. I think in general, people have tried to sort of rid those false equivalencies or to supplement it with context and fact checks. But there also are, frankly, just sometimes like in a political context where like you do have to lay out, this is what A says, this is what B says. But then again, I think without that context and fact check, right, what's the point?
Catie, we want to thank you today for being here with us. And I think that I speak for all of us in commending you for helping us to know the truth. We're in a time in human history where we do ask this question, what is truth? And knowing that there are people like you who desperately want to tell the truth and inform us as citizens matters a lot. We commend you today for the work that you are doing with truth telling. You are a source from whom we can receive it as we discern as people of faith, how to follow God, to know the context of our community. That said, Reinhold Niebuhr said that pastors read the Bible in the left hand and the newspaper in the right. So we want our community and its vision to be relevant. And so we thank you for your partnership as a reporter who tells the truth in this journey that we're on. And finally, we're a community that believes, just like you do, that words have power. And so we commend you for the words that you choose, for the work that you do to tell the truth with words and help shape this world through words. So we lift you up and cannot thank you enough for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you. That's so kind. Thank you.
Okay. Can I ask one more question? Can I ask you one more question? Oh, I want to thank you for your thoughtful comments and reflections on your work. I notice that you work in Capitol, but you also get out into the country.
I do. So I've been traveling a lot the past few months. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of whether the polarization is greater in Congress than it is among the public? Do you notice a difference?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Has that changed over time?
It's a really good question. It's so hard to tell, I think, because of the dynamic that I was talking about where, my inbox can be filled with screeds, but when I show up on someone's front door or at the restaurant that they're at, they're really kind. And I do think, unfortunately, that has become a real schism in public life, is that, it's hard to be, I think it's hard for most people to be rude to someone in person, but it's very easy to online. And so when I'm out in sort of like on the campaign trail, most of the people that I'm talking to do not seem that ideological or polarized unless I'm in a super polarized place like a Trump rally, for example. Obviously, you're going to get super polarized people there. It's probably true that Congress is a little bit more polarized. I don't know. There are members of Congress who you would never expect to be friends, on the left and right, who are friends. Famously, Justice Scalia and Ginsburg, were great friends, went to the opera together, and you do see some crossovers like that on the Hill. But again, I think it shows a lot of the polarization on the Hill, honestly, is performative in a way that I think is really unfortunate because it is to sort of fire up the bases, right? A lot of people are not thinking about, how can I reach across the aisle and get something done, particularly if they're in a super gerrymandered district, which increasingly districts are. They're thinking about, how do I keep my base happy? How do I keep my super Republican or super Democratic voters happy? And so I do think a lot of some of the polarization you see is totally real. A lot of it, I think, is, either jacked up a lot or performative for cameras. And that is really unfortunate. And I don't know how we change that. It didn't used to be that lawmakers were doing all of these hits on Fox or MSNBC, but they are. So we are going to have to figure out how to dial it down a little bit.
Okay, we got one more
Yeah.
question from Mark and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks again for being here. You touched on it briefly in one point in your talk about the schisms in the Republican leadership in the House, and I don't know if it's a codified rule or if it's a party rule, but the notion that if one member wants to challenge who's the speaker, then they have to go and have a battle. And obviously, going back to the beginning of this particular Congress, it took them days to elect a speaker. Do you think that will change, or is that likely to stay the way it is?
It's a great question. So what he's referring to also is, and it was not always this way, that is a rule that is set by the ruling party in the House. And that was actually a concession that Kevin McCarthy negotiated in order to become Speaker. So he did not, as you alluded to, he did not have the votes for a very long time to become House Speaker. It was one of the key demands that this group of arch conservatives had made of him. They said, we'd be comfortable voting for you if you agree to change the threshold. It used to be, I think Republicans had a threshold of like 12 lawmakers. I can't remember what it was. It was a bigger mass, but they were like, we want to bring it down to one person can put this, sheet in the hopper and say, I'm calling a snap vote to oust the speaker. He held out for a really long time, but then he realized he was not going to become speaker unless he agreed to it. And that is what put us in the position that we are all in now. If Democrats win the House, they will certainly get rid of that. They have never had anything like that. I think Speaker Nancy Pelosi was like, it has to be a majority plus one of people that want to oust me. She set the threshold so high to ensure that it would simply never happen. Thing is, it's really hard to put the horse back in the barn, right? I think depending on who the Republican speaker is, they probably would try to change that if they still had control of the House come January. But it's a hard argument to make, right? Of like, I want to give myself more power is the way that it would be construed. Now, I think there'd be a lot of Republicans who would say, look, we saw what the one vote motion to vacate got us. It got us basically a year full of chaos and pain and political pain. Let's not go through that again. But again, if it's a tight majority, they're going to need a majority vote on that. Just a few people holding out could doom an effort to change it. So I think there will be an effort to try to change it. Whether they can or not, I think remains to be seen. It depends on how much Republicans trust who the next speaker would be. But I think you're also flicking at an important point, which I did not get to, which is if Republicans win the House majority or keep the House majority, the speaker fight in January is going to be crazy. I almost like don't want to think about covering it because I think Speaker Mike Johnson will have a good argument to make as, you know, I kept our House majority. You should reelect me as speaker. But, you know, DC it's a scheming group of people who always are looking to get more power for themselves. And I think he would probably have some real challengers who would say, well, what do we have to show for the last 2 year of your speakership? So we will see, but your question is a good one because it foreshadows, I think, more intrigue to come. We'll leave it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And come back next week for this room is going to be filled with tables of all the activities and committees and wonderful things we do for you to get involved in, including our committee, if you're interested.